Welcome everyone to the last in the Animal Issues Thematic Cluster's interview series in connection with the 2020 High-Level Political Forum, which is concluding tomorrow. Today, we are interviewing Dr. Andrew Rowan. Andrew is the Chief Program Officer of WellBeing International. He is also a veteran of the animal cause with more than 40 years of experience in animal advocacy, including as the CEO of Humane Society International. Today, we will be speaking with him on people, animals, and the environment in sustainability policy. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
My first question is a topical one. In what ways has the current pandemic highlighted connections between the well-being of animals and the well-being of people?
Well, one very obvious connection is basically that the wet market, the origin of the virus that is now traveling across the world, appears to have come from a wet market in China. And that's raised the visibility of wet markets and frankly of live animal markets globally anyway. And so there's been a lot more activity around trying to get the wet market shut down and trying to sort of identify the dangers of this type of activity across the world. I mean, the wet markets are horrible places for animals. They're not very good places for people. It's something that everybody is now sort of looking at and seeing what can be done about it.
Have there been any significant developments in terms of government or international policies in direct response to the pandemic regarding wildlife, regarding the treatment of animals that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I mean, the Chinese have made moves to shut down the wet markets, which is something that I think is a good initial step. We're still struggling to figure out just how far they're going to go with that and what they're going to do about the general consumption of wild animals. They do farm a lot of wild animal species, so it's not clear how those farms are going to be affected and how that ultimately is going to sort of interplay with animals and public health. So that's important. There's calls on the WHO to address the wet market issue, and those have expanded now to include calls to sort of start addressing intensive animal agriculture, which has been, the world has been alerted to the dangers of intensive animal agriculture through the H1N1 virus, avian virus that emerged in 2009. So this is not a theoretical problem. This is a real life issue. And I suspect we're going to get a lot more attention paid to it in the coming years.
WellBeing International centers the concept of the PAE triad in its work. Could you please explain what is the PAE triad and how does that guide your organization's campaigns?
Well, yeah, WellBeing International was started as a organization that would not just focus on one of the single elements. There are a lot of organizations that advocate for animals. There are a lot of organizations, of course, that advocate for humans, and there are a lot of organizations that advocate for environment. And what we felt was that that sort of specificity or focus on a single arena was problematic because you then ignore the other elements. So, I mean, in the sort of whole issue of wet markets and the building of opposition to the consumption of wildlife, one of the issues that comes up in that is that maybe billions of people around the world currently get some of their protein from catching and eating wildlife. And so if you eliminate the consumption of wildlife, what do you do about those folks who are getting at least some protein, maybe a substantial part of their protein from that type of activity? I would say that that sort of consumption is not sustainable. As the population of the world grows, there's going to be less wildlife around, and there'll be less room for people to go out and capture and eat it. We see this already in Africa, for example, where the bushmeat market is sort of pouring meat into the cities, and it's not clear how much that's affected the decline in wild animal numbers across Africa. But it seems to be a serious issue. So it's that. So we talk about people, animals, and the environment seeking solutions for all three, because we feel that just animals, just people, just environment is only part of the problem. We need to sort of consider all three elements.
Regarding the specific issue that you mentioned, the fact that efforts to shut down or even to regulate the wildlife trade can impact people who are dependent on wildlife, either for sustenance or for their livelihood, or for both. What kinds of measures do you think can be taken to combat the wildlife trade in a way that is equitable, that doesn't aggravate problems for humans?
It's a really tough question, Wolf, because I don't think a lot of attention has been paid to it. There's a lot of activity around the bushmeat problem, but people have been, only recently have they begun to quantify the problem and then identify how much of human protein resources are coming from that aspect of those bushmeat. And so it's, we're just beginning to get our hands around what the scale of the issue is. And so that's, to me, something that we need to have. We need to have some of the data that we can start saying, okay, we're talking about 1 billion people, we're talking about 2 billion people. What can we do about making sure that they have adequate nutrition without necessarily destroying all of the wilderness and all of the wild animals in it? And that, I don't think that discussion has really begun. There's been a lot of discussion about ending bushmeat, but not a tremendous amount of discussion about, well, wait a minute, what do we do if we do that? And that's part of the problem.
Is that the area in which WellBeing International primarily works, the gathering of data, or are you more on the level of implementing campaigns, more direct action based on information that's already been gathered?
Well, I guess we're defined by the various sort of people who monitor NGOs. We're defined as a conservation and science organization. There was nothing for animal protection that we could, so we couldn't be that, but they defined us as a conservation and science. And we're comfortable with that notion. Because we feel that the science is a really important part of this. And of course, it's my background. I've been involved at the Humane Society. I was the chief scientific officer for 20 years. And so it's something that is part of my DNA. And so I've been trying to sort of work on that as something that we should include and incorporate into our outreach. But the other part of it here is that we don't think that there's sufficient collaborative activity. So, I mean, on our global dog campaign, for example, there's lots of activity going around the world about taking care of dogs and addressing dog welfare issues. But there's not a lot of people working together on that. And yet you've got maybe 100, 200 organizations in India doing some significant work, but they're not really, to my mind, exchanging much in the way of information. You do now have the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations, but they haven't really sort of said to each other, okay, how do we make sure that what we're doing in India is really having an impact? And so that's where we sort of argue. What we need is we need to have some idea of how many street dogs there are, how many pet dogs there are. Interestingly enough, the pet dog, street dog relationship seems to be, it's about 50-50 in the major cities in India. About half the dogs are street dogs and about half the dogs are pet dogs. And yet nobody's really talking about the pet dog side of things. And so it's something that we're going to need to address as we move forward. As the street dog problem gets reduced, as it has, I believe, anyway, over the course of the last 20 years in India, we're going to have to start thinking about, okay, well, what is the relationship between street dogs and pet dogs, and how do we address and manage those relationships? Globally, there's been a lot, my estimate is around $30 million a year are spent on dog issues by the international organizations alone, not counting the local groups. And yet I don't think we're getting $30 million worth of impact. And so that's part of what we're trying to do with the Global Dog Campaign, is to get people to start looking at their impact and start measuring what they're doing and then reporting on it, so that we can see, okay, what types of activities actually have an impact in reducing dog populations. And so, I mean, one of the things that I find remarkable, there's only one place in the world today, in the developing world, where we have more than 10 years worth of data on trends in dog populations, and that's Jaipur. You know, so that's, I think, remarkable, because most of these activities require at least 5 years to begin to show impact, and preferably longer. So Jaipur is our landmark project at this point in time, because it has all of that additional data, and you can see what impact it is having on the city.
This is a very broad question, but globally, what would you identify as the most pressing issues in terms of the suffering that they cause both for animals and the impact that they have on human needs? And what kinds of actions, what kinds of programs or policies are needed to address these?
It's broad, but I think it's a relatively easy one to answer, because by and large, what we're looking at is the farm animal, sort of the raising of animals for consumption is probably the major animal welfare issue. And of course, it's a huge issue for human health and well-being as well. And it has considerable impacts on the environment. So if you look at some of the data, the Oxford Center, Our World in Data, for example, has identified that, has produced a graph showing that 18% of the world's protein needs, sorry, let me get this right, 18% of the world's protein needs are being met by intensive animal agriculture, but they're using 80% of the arable land. And so that's a major disconnect in terms of impact and efficiency. And so these and the farm animal issue and the intensive animal agriculture issue then bleeds into the wildlife problem, and the fact that we're losing wildlife at an accelerating rate. It's not just only about 15% of the world's arable land is now available for wildlife. And that's why we have so few tigers in the wild, why we're having fewer and fewer lions in the wild, and so on. There's going to be increasing pressure on the large carnivores and on the large wild animals in terms of their population. And so we need to do something about this for both farm animal welfare, for environmental well-being, for wild animal well-being, and for human well-being.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of animal agriculture and its impact on the environment, since this is something that the United Nations has recognized for quite some time now. Since 2006, they've acknowledged that animal agriculture is one of the top 2 drivers of climate change. And yet on the level of policies and initiatives, this acknowledgement is often lacking. For instance, last year at the High Level Political Forum, there was an event to launch the Decade on Family Farming. And nowhere in their launch document of 70+ pages did they even mention the connection between animal agriculture and climate change. Why do you think there's such a disconnect between theoretical recognition of this link and actually taking any steps in practice?
Well, meat eating is a really challenging topic to address in an effective way. As has been pointed out in the United States, about 3% of the population is vegetarian, but another 6% are ex-vegetarians. So the issue, it's a lifestyle issue. It's also been demonstrated that, in fact, vegetarianism is one of those issues that really gets the backs up of people who are not vegetarians. And so it's an interesting, challenging topic to address overall. And so I suspect one of the reasons why there's this disconnect with the intensive animal agriculture issue is because meat eating is so central to who we think we are as individuals. And it's something that is becoming increasingly problematic, and even a place like India, where you've got a large proportion of the population of vegetarian, relatively large, 25, 30%, some because of need and necessity, and some because it's an ethical decision. But it's still, you're getting, the joke in India is that chicken is the new vegetable. And so we really don't have a good grasp on what is going on here and why it is such a difficult issue to address. But I believe it's at the root cause of a whole range of policy issues is why we're having so much struggle to start to make any significant progress in this arena, despite the fact that IPBES, the UN agency that talked about wild animals, the Lancet Eat Commission, and other major bodies have come out now and said we need to eat lower on the food chain. So there's a lot more advocacy of that by establishment organizations. And so I suspect we're going to see some changes, but it's going to be tough.
Just a note to viewers, if you wish to submit questions of your own, you may do so using the chat feature, and toward the end of our conversation, I will select from those questions and present them for Andrew to answer. Generally speaking, to what extent is animal protection currently upheld as a priority in international law and policy?
Well, I would argue to a very small extent. I mean, the international policy arena and animal welfare was something that the various animal advocacy organizations were having trouble getting their hands around and having any real impact. So lots of attempts have been made to influence the United Nations over the years without any noticeable change. But then I guess about 10, 15 years ago, the OIE decided that it would make animal welfare an issue that it would address. And under Dr. Balat, the former Director General, they started to sort of look at animal welfare. As a result, that led to the FAO and WHO also beginning to weigh in on animal welfare issues. And there's a sort of, shall we say, international competitiveness between these various international agencies to have some programs and some activities and some statements on animal welfare. WHO, much less so these days. In fact, everybody's talking about One Health and trying to sort of promote the idea that it's not just human health, it's animal health, it's environmental health, this One Health concept. And yet, if you go on the WHO website, you see virtually nothing on One Health on the WHO website. There is a paper, but that's about it. There's no, even the index doesn't have One Health in the index. And so this indicates to me how challenging it is to start to get the animal issue into the international agenda. I mean, the OIE has taken it on. They have developed some recommendations and some guidelines, but they're minimal. It's not a huge, and as far as I can see globally, they're enforced mostly in the absence rather than as effective proposals. And so it's beginning to work, but it's going to take time.
Could you talk a little bit more about the concept of One Health? Within the animal protection movement, there's been discussion of One Welfare as a related concept that would specifically highlight the treatment of animals in terms of their needs, in terms of physical, psychological well-being being a factor in health, both for the animals themselves and the people. Do you believe this is a useful concept to be linked to One Health? Since you seem to, from what you've told us, it sounds as though One Health is itself very much a neglected concept at present.
Well, it's One Health is a little like motherhood. Everybody knows it's important, but nobody's doing anything about it, sort of thing. It's the famous Oscar Wilde quote about everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. And so One Health has long been sort of bruited around mostly by the veterinary world. So it was something that was pushed out there about 30, 40, 50 years ago by a veterinarian from UC Davis, who wrote a book called Cattle, Priests, and Medicine, in which he argued that, the human health and animal health were closely intertwined, as the latest pandemic is demonstrating. And the pandemic is now sort of getting people to pay more attention to One Health. And yet, it's, as I said, I was surprised that there wasn't something, at least an index term on the WHO website for One Health. That seems to me to be an obvious oversight that needs to be corrected. But it's also, I think, an indication that when people start talking about One Health, they're mostly focusing about human health. It's a little bit, I know you want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a little bit like the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of issues about sustainability, but they're all very anthropocentric. When it comes down to it, yeah, they mention animals, yes, they mention environment, but it's mostly based on what's good for humans. They're not worrying so much. They're mentioning the environment only in the sense that it's got to be good for humans. We've got to make sure that humans are healthy and humans are well taken care of, rather than the animals. And so there's this, I see the One Health focus in the same way. And One Welfare at this point in time is a very new concept that's been out there. There have been 2 international meetings. I was at the second one. It was attended by maybe 100, 150 people, most of them locally from in Australia. Very few international representation, very little international representation at the conference. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we're not really getting much traction in those arenas.
You're right that I did want to ask about sustainable development and the SDGs. Sustainable development has become kind of a guiding paradigm for the United Nations at the high-level political forums and in its 2030 agenda. How much progress do you think can be made for animals within the sustainable development paradigm? Because on the one hand, it acknowledges the connections between different issues, between humans and the environment and other living creatures, but on the other hand, it very much centers human interests. Do you see it as more of an opportunity to advance animal protection, or more of an obstacle?
I would argue it's a bit of both, and that our impact and effectiveness needs to sort of look at where we can have the influence and avoid the obstacles, shall we say. So certainly we can start raising issues about the sustainable development and the fact that only by sort of taking care of the environment, by taking care of animals, will we be able to enable sustainable development over the long term. But so we'll be sort of taking little bites of the apple, identifying those bites that could be most effective and beginning to sort of introduce that. And as an example, I would talk about the 3rd African Animal Welfare Conference that was held in Addis Ababa last year. You were at that. And basically what I saw there was that this was the 3rd conference. It was started by an MOU between the United Nations Environment Programme and ANOR, the Kenyan Animal Welfare Group. And they are now getting the African Union to start talking about animal welfare in more than just throwaway terms, but actually sort of starting to think about, well, what can we do and how can it be important? And the whole donkey skin trade issue was one that was really focused and highlighted at that meeting. I suspect that the UNEP you're going to get people in UNEP now whose business and jobs are associated with animal welfare. They're going to begin paying a lot more attention to it. And that as a result, over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years, you're going to get more attention being paid by the United Nations Environmental Programme on this, and also by the African Union. And so that to me is a good sign of what we can achieve under these circumstances, but it is small bites at the apple. But I would go back to the fact that in 1975, when I first became involved in the animal movement, our big victories in those days were getting a letter published in one of the major newspapers in England. That was the victory. We used to reprint those letters and send them out to our supporters saying, look, we got a letter in the Times. I mean, And how far have we come since then? We're now talking about influencing the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation. We're trying to get the UN to pay attention to these issues. We've got legislation. The EU is a major, has major animal welfare policies. Animal sentience is at the core of the EU treaty. I mean, there's been a huge change in the past 50 years. And so I think that, you know, we need to sort of reflect on that and remember that, and then build on that and build the steps and take the steps forward. SDGs, I don't think they're particularly important for animal welfare just now, but they could become so.
I have a question that was submitted in advance of the interview by Eliane. I may be mispronouncing her name, I apologize if I am, who asks if it would help for animal protection to be explicitly acknowledged within the SDGs. For example, if an 18th Sustainable Development Goal on animal protection was added. Do you think that would be helpful?
Well, obviously, I think that would be helpful in the same way that the African Union is now attending to animal welfare within its organization. Is helpful, but initially you basically getting just verbal support, not any real action. I'm not sure that I would focus on getting an 18th SDG introduced. I mean, we've got the AITC targets, which are all about the environment and wild animals, and those are ones that we could be pushing and promoting and trying to get some actual impact. I mean, the AITC targets are not being met at all. So, you know, we can start pushing those targets to try and get a better response and more responsiveness. The CITES issue, there's a lot of attention being paid on CITES now that it's meant to be sort of governing wild animal trade. And yet, if you look at the volume of wild animal trade in the last 20 years, it's just been going steadily up and up and up. And CITES doesn't seem to be able to, it just doesn't have the budget to do anything about it. There's about a $5 million budget. We really need to fund CITES and give it enforcement powers to really begin to have an impact on it. You know, and so these are some of the issues that I would say are lower hanging fruits than necessarily trying to sort of get an 18th SDG into the mix.
Jessica has two questions. I'm going to start with the more specific one and then close with the more general one. So the first question being, how do you think that we can get better traction for the concept of one welfare in international policy?
Well, I think it's already started. You've got various individuals who are sort of making one welfare their raison d'etre for being around. And so the next conference is going to be held in 2021 in Spain, in Burgos, Spain. I suspect that if we could get more individuals present and more of the movement present at that, we could start turning that one welfare conference into a much bigger international event. There is, in fact, no international event for animal welfare, one welfare. Specifically. I mean, so there's no place where the major animal groups come together. There's no place where the national animal groups come together specifically. We do have some regional conferences now, like the Asia for Animals Conference or the African Conference. But I think we need to start sort of thinking about, well, getting people together to articulate and argue, well, what does one welfare mean? What does it mean in terms of where can we make actual policy advancements in terms of one welfare, and how can we have that work to the benefit of, as I would say, people, animals, and the environment?
What is the event that you mentioned in Spain that relates to One Health and One Welfare in 2021, and how can people from within the animal movement become involved in that?
Well, the One Welfare was articulated initially by a Spanish academic, and I apologize, I don't recall her name right at the moment, but she's in Spain, and she is the one who wants to hold the third One Welfare conference. The first one was in Canada. The second one included some of the original Canadian speakers in Sydney last year. and the third one is meant to be next year in Burgos, Spain. So if you Google One Welfare and put in Burgos, B-U-R-G-O-S, you should find that event. I'm not sure, of course, whether it'll be held at this point in time. It may just be a virtual conference, but at any rate, that's the next event that's meant to be occurring.
Now for Jessica's second question. What meaningful actions do you think can be taken within the UN system to leverage the synergies between human and animal well-being? And what role can civil society play in helping to move this conversation forward?
Well, Jessica probably has a much better grasp of what could be done and what the potential is, as would Janice Cox or Linda Koch. I've never been particularly engaged with the United Nations. And in fact, when I was running Humane Society International, we didn't pay a lot of attention to the United Nations because there was never, whatever the United Nations did could not be enforced. And so we were looking for areas where we could change policy and then have that policy enforced or implemented in some meaningful way. And the United Nations has always been more of a talking shop than an enforcement agency. So that was one of the reasons why I didn't spend a lot of time on UN. It was my colleagues advised us that would be the way forward. But I think that we're getting to the point where more attention to the United Nations would be valuable. So United Nations Development Organization, as an example, did a survey in Bosnia asking the local communities what they really wanted help with. And they expected to get all sorts of things about sort of personal violence or threats against women or environmental issues or food security or things of that nature, and were surprised when the survey came back because a number of communities said what they really needed help with was stray dogs. So the UNDP then built a partnership with IFOR, who have now since decided they don't want to do anything with stray dogs, and so unfortunately they've moved out of that space. But IFOR and the UNDP did several projects in communities in Bosnia, working with the community to address the stray dog problem. And it was very much ground up, not IFOR coming in and telling the community this is what you need to do. They came in and said, well, what do you think you need to do? And provided the context for those types of activities. And at the end of the day, they helped deal with the stray dog problem, but more interestingly was that this approach and this topic got the community breaking down some of the barriers, the ethnic barriers that existed, and people started working together again and being neighbors and so on. So it was a really interesting project, unfortunately not well documented, but a very interesting project on how one could get this sort of thing to sort of move forward. And the UNDP has now issued a follow-up contract because they felt it was so effective. So if we could go to the UNDP and say, look, we can do this around the world. If there are places where there's violence and ethnic violence, maybe we can address that ethnic violence sort of coming at it from the back end, so to speak, by talking about, well, how do we take care of the stray dogs in your community? And then people start working together and develop a trusting relationship, and that has an impact on a broader range of social issues. So I'm really interested in the use of, say, animal protection initiatives as a way to begin to break down sort of interpersonal or ethnic challenges in communities around the world. Because it's everybody, humane education is relatively non-controversial. Everybody thinks it's good to teach kids to be kind to animals. But if you then, there's a sort of subterfuge that you're introducing here, that you're actually making them not just kind to animals, but you're increasing the civic relationships and civic interaction and civic cohesion of those communities. And so I'm really interested in how we might do that. Unfortunately, I have only a few isolated examples of how this works. And so I don't really have any good data to support this, but I'm convinced that it works.
You brought up the issue of free-roaming dogs before, and we are running short on time, so I'll make this the last question. But since it's come up again, could you explain a little bit about why this was an issue that communities prioritized so highly? How does the presence of free-roaming stray dogs impact human well-being? And what are the ways in which this can be addressed in a humane, effective manner?
Well, people were worried about packs of stray dogs roaming around, not just attacking livestock, which they did, but also being dangerous to the people in the community. So I mean, this was classic in Romania. You remember with the stray dogs in Bucharest, people were worried about these packs of dogs that lived outside these high-rise apartments, and you got these older people were being threatened by the dogs as they brought their groceries into their apartments and so on. And so it was just one of those things that people said, can't we do something? I mean, it's not as though this is ethnic violence. Can't we do something about this type of problem? This would make a big difference in our lives. And that's what they found. That's what it did. It made a big difference in their lives by addressing that stray dog problem. So I mean, it's coming at it from a different perspective. And one of the things I noticed about the dog issue, I've been looking at it very carefully for the last 12 months now. And if you look at the United States, that in the 1950, there were about 30-odd million dogs in the United States. 1/3 of them were strays. But today there are no strays. And so, well, very few. There's strays in some of the Native American areas and maybe in a few inner cities. But by and large, you don't see strays in America anymore. And I see that trend is happening in other parts of the world. So in Costa Rica, the percentage of dogs sleeping indoors at night has jumped from 27% to 54% in just 8 years. And so you begin to see the change in the human-dog relationship there. And I've been looking around, there are about 900 million dogs in the world today. About 500 million of those are pets, and 300 to 400 million are street dogs. And I'm willing to bet that in 20 years' time, most of those street dogs will be living indoors, being part of a household of some sort, a formal household of some sort. It's happening in India, happening in Costa Rica. I see it happening in China. So these are sort of interesting issues about, I think we can make a real difference for both people and the dogs across the world by just focusing on, okay, we're all making a difference. We're changing the way this happens. And the classic example is Jaipur. In Jaipur, the number of dog bites per 1,000 people in the city in 1995, when they started the spay-neuter program, was about 700 per 100,000 people every year. Today, it's about 250 or 200 per 100,000 people. And that's about one third of the decline is due to the fact that they've cut out a lot of the breeding behavior, which causes people to get bitten. But another third of that decline is because we don't know why. We think it's a change in the human-dog interaction, the way people interact with the dogs, but we haven't documented why it happens. But I have seen that we can change the human-dog interaction, reduce the dog bite rate substantially by relatively simple means, i.e. in Jaipur by sterilizing the street dogs.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Andrew, for your time and for all of the information that you've shared. We greatly appreciate it. And that concludes our interview series for HLPF 2020. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wolf.